Thanks, Wayne. Oh, what a pleasure to be here. It's actually an honor to be here because Wayne's right. Shalem Mental Health Network is a big network. There's lots of us. And I tried to be the first one to say I wanted to come. So I feel pretty lucky because this church was so special for me and my husband and I when we first got married. So I got lots of beautiful memories here. But I also feel honored because this topic isn't an easy one. And I don't know what brought you in here tonight and why you're interested in learning more about grief. But I can imagine, because grief touches all of us. And so, before we start, I'm wondering if we can just take a minute to be quiet and just to honor all those who have gone before us and maybe honor the reason why you're here tonight. So as Wayne said, my name is Amy, and I have been a music therapist since 2013. So what's that now, 11 years? And then right before COVID, decided to go back to school and get my talk therapy degree so that I can do both. I actually worked at Granville Hospital with Marlies over there, so that's kind of fun to say hi to her again. I worked in psychiatry for a long time, but I've worked all over the place. And as you can imagine, music is a beautiful tool. So there's a lot of people that want to hire us, which is awesome. And now I work at Shalem Mental Health Network, based in Hamilton, so not too far away. And we offer services, we're a Family Service Ontario Centre, so we offer services to anyone. We offer psychotherapy, wraparound care and support. We have restorative practice circles that we run, faith care circles specific for church conflict. And we also have a Recreate art outreach studio for young people on the street. So we do a lot of things. We're also a network that stretches from coast to coast. So we've got providers all over Canada. But our main kind of hub is Hamilton. So that's a bit about me. And I wish I could go around and hear more about you, because I can bet there's a story of why you're here. But I'm going to try tonight to do a really quick wash of some basics around navigating grief. It is such a bewildering experience, isn't it? It's just so disorienting, and it hurts. And so sometimes having a roadmap, having some descriptions of what might happen, having some expectations can be helpful. And so that's what I'm going to try to do this evening. So right off the hop, I gave out some handouts just for those of you who like to take notes. Again, you don't need to, but if you're one of those people. I like to just start with defining some of the terms that are related to grief. Bereavement is the loss of a loved one by death. So we become bereaved, we are bereavers, when we've experienced a loss of a loved one by death. And so that brings me to what's loss. What is loss? And really, loss is any life change that is marked by absence. Any life change marked by absence. So you can probably imagine this doesn't just mean death, right? So this could mean moving, changing jobs or roles, having dreams never come true, losing your independence, losing your health, right? There's a lot of loss that can happen, right? And then specifically in this category, we have the word grief, which is really our response to bereavement or loss. Okay? Grief is our response to bereavement or loss. So hopefully that just helps you kind of place a few things. And what I really want you to take away, there's a couple big ideas tonight. One of them, I wrote big letters on your handout, okay? Grief is a normal response. It isn't a sickness. You can't go and get prescribed medication for grief. I mean, I think a lot of us wish you could, just to take the pain away, right? But it is normal, okay? It is normal. And often it's marked by a lot of change. So not only are we feeling a lot of pain in grief, but there's also so much change happening. So it's kind of like a double whammy. It's just like wham, wham, yeah? There's a very famous grief specialist who worked with Dr. Kubler-Ross, who wrote about the stages of grief. We've probably heard of the stages of grief. Okay, so her kind of protege, Dr. Kessler, he said this. He said, the hardest grief is your own. He often got questions in lectures saying, so who has it the worst? And he said, that is such an awful question. What an awful question. Grief is painful, and so the worst grief is your own grief, okay? Here are some signs that grief might be happening, either in yourself or in someone else. And you probably know this, but I'm just going to read a few. It's not an exhaustive list. Feeling stuck, isolation, numbness, depressed mood, sadness, anger, confusion, and waves of emotion, sleeplessness and fatigue, poor concentration, loss of appetite, hearing the voice of the deceased, and I could go on. Because grief impacts our biology, our emotions, our spiritual selves, and our social selves. It really impacts all of us. So there's symptoms of grief in every category of human functioning. Okay, so assuming that we've all experienced some kind of loss or grief in this room, sometimes it's helpful to know some benchmarks. Like, what would goals be? If I'm grieving, what should I look for? And I've kind of organized them arbitrarily into 3 categories. This is according to me. This isn't like an evidence-based thing. But just to make it easier for tonight, there are 3 categories. Allow, ask, and act. 3 A's. Allow, ask, and act. So what do I mean by allow? Well, allow the stages, which they're not linear stages. They're not like, oh, finally I'm through anger, I'll never feel angry again. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. They're more like descriptions of what to look for, right? So allow things like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Those would be like Kubler-Ross's 5 stages. Allow them to happen. They're going to happen. Allow them to happen. Allow yourself to remember. Allow new normals. Allow self-compassion. Now, under ACT, it takes a lot of work to adapt to all the change. And we find grief is aggravated. It's made a little bit trickier if we isolate for a really long time. We don't do anything. We just kind of withdraw from all of life. So really focusing on trying to act, stick to routines. That's like a goal, right? Trying to get to your routines, even if it doesn't feel good. Just really simple stuff. You don't have to adopt all New Year's resolutions while you're grieving, right? But just what feels like, okay, I know what to do. I have breakfast at this time. Routine. So that's kind of a goal in grief, is to stick to your routine and to get your butt out of the chair and actually do something. it sounds easy, but if you've ever grieved, it's actually very, very hard. Yeah. So that kind of makes up the act. Ask. Ask is the other big category. You gotta connect with others. It's gotta be something you share. If we try to just carry grief on our own, it crushes us. It's too much pain. It hurts too bad. So trying to connect with others, this is a time to lean into rituals. If you used to go to church, or if you used to go to a program at the YMCA, keep doing that, and just connect with the same people. And you don't have to spill your guts, but just, connect. Try to be part of a bigger community. If you need help, ask. And if you don't want to talk about it, still ask for connection, right? Okay, so those are kind of some goals, right? Things that we can do to help us focus ourselves here in a very disorienting time. Now, I sometimes get asked about risk factors, like what should I look for if the grief is kind of getting off the rails? And again, this isn't an exhaustive list, but here are some of the more popular things that I would kind of say you can look for. One would be, it's very common to turn to coping strategies during grief that are unhelpful, in excess. And some are more harmful than others. Right, and so it's very common to increase alcohol use during grief, for example, which, I'm not here to tell you how much to drink, but it's more just to be mindful of that, right? Once we kind of mindlessly use alcohol to cope, we can develop secondary issues, right? It's actually important to see a family doctor when you're grieving, especially, in the acute stages, just so that someone's tracking some already existing health concerns, checking in, making sure that medically there's not anything going to be exacerbated during the time. So that's something that I would look for. It's a risk factor, is developing different medical issues. Excess anger. Okay, excess anger, if that goes untreated, can cause some tricky habits, I'll call them. Yeah? So, anger left unchecked for a long period of time, if you're finding the anger's kind of popping up and making a difference in your life, in other areas that have nothing to do with your loss, that might be interesting, like good information for you to pay attention to. And it's very common to have thoughts like, it should have been me. It's very common to have thoughts like, I want to be with the person who has died. But if we start dwelling on death, that would be a risk factor. Dwelling on death, that would be a time to maybe reach out for a therapist in that moment to kind of help with some possible suicidal thoughts. Which, by the way, are common. Okay, so I don't want you to feel like that's an anomaly. It's very common, very common. Okay, so how to support someone who's grieving? Again, with this allow, act, and ask, those kind of big themes, there's lots of ways. There's so many ways. If you see someone is hurting, if you see someone has lost something or someone and they're really struggling, there are lots of ways to support them. So for allowing, be with them. Allow them. Allow them to be sad or angry or whatever they're feeling. Be with them. Allow first anniversaries, right? But be close by. They're really tricky. First anniversaries are tough, okay? So we want to let them happen. We don't need to avoid them, okay? But we want to be close by, checking in, seeing if they're okay. Allow good days and bad days. And we'll talk more about that. Allow good days and bad days. Yeah. Allow the tension and awkwardness. So we don't need to make sweeping statements or compare grief. Like, at least you didn't blah, blah, blah. Or, well, you got a silver lining because, you still have whatever. Those really don't. I would just say, let's not do that. Okay? As one who has grieved, that was really unhelpful when folks did that. So, really being mindful of when we feel awkward, right? And just allowing space. That awkwardness is okay. It is awkward. It's sad. It's painful. So that's allow. How to support someone by acting would be sometimes distraction. Right? Hey, do you want to come with me to the market? Hey, do you want to come to a movie? Hey, do you want to, do you want to come do Sudoku with me? Or, just kind of like getting your mind off things. Yeah, so that can be ask and act, right? We can support someone's healthy routines, right? Hey, do you want me to cook you a meal? I see, you don't have much in your fridge. Can I just bring over some soup later? Important also to be mindful of symptoms of, some of the risk factors. And just be noticing, right? Be noticing so that you can act and kind of be there, helpful, supportive, if they need help reaching out. And for ask, listen well. Oh my goodness. Let the stories just flow. I mean, it can be really healing to talk about what has been lost or who has been lost, right? And so ask about the person or what has been lost, right? Ask. If they don't want to talk, they won't. Okay, they will just say no thanks. But if you ask, then it shows how much you care about their pain, right? Ask if they want to come to social gatherings. Just don't say nothing is, I guess, the point. Don't say nothing at all. At the very least, we can say, I'm so sorry for your loss, right? Something like that. Very simple. So, when we're moving through grief, as fast or as slow as it takes us, because it will never not hurt. Right? The goal, it's different than medical issues or mental health issues, where the goal is kind of like, oh, let's be symptom-free, right? Let's get you on track. Let's get you feeling better. When it comes to grief, it's never not going to hurt, right? But we can move through grief, and we can adjust to the changes while still remembering and still bringing what has been lost or who has been lost with us. And this model here is really, really helpful. There are days where the whole day is going to be loss-oriented. Okay? When we're grieving, there are days where we are just not up for anything. Like down and out, leave me alone, go away. I want to just bury myself in my bed. Go away. We deny or avoid any kind of change. We say, no, I just want them to be back. I want it to be back, whatever it may be. We might kind of avoid our friends, we just feel overcome. There's going to be days like that. That does not mean the grief is going backwards. Okay? Absolutely not. That is just part of grief. It comes in waves. Like that. And then there will be days, sometimes these other days are more distressing actually, where we're doing new things. We find ourselves doing new things. We find ourselves, wow, I forgot for like an hour. And there's a lot of emotional work that happens there when we forgot for an hour, right? Sometimes that doesn't actually feel very good. Even though the changes weren't bad, right? The feeling of, I forgot for an hour. How do I feel about that? How do I make sense of that? Can be tricky. And the brilliance of this diagram isn't acknowledging that those two are normal. It's what happens in the middle. Okay? That this is very normal, normative, mainstream. What one would expect is to oscillate regularly between these two every day for the rest of your life. Right? And I love this jagged line because it's like, oh, I might be, no, I'm going to stay over here, and it's kind of like that. It's very unexpected. We might feel, really fresh and excited for this new chapter, and then all of a sudden for 3 days, we're back down, That is so common. So just consider that, consider that as we rethink what grief is and what it should be. Okay, so let's just briefly go to the back page here. I wanted to offer some comments on some special populations. So, grief is a human phenomenon, so even children grieve. And, when I'm working with kids who are grieving, there's a lot of the same kinds of activities that we would do in therapy for kids who aren't grieving. We still do them in therapy for kids who are grieving. Like, they're being kids. But they won't have the same kind of adult way of grieving, right? For example, they might ask a lot of questions, ones that kind of make us uncomfortable, right? Or they might show their emotions on their sleeve, which also can make us feel really uncomfortable, right? So for children, sometimes there's this myth that we protect them by not talking about it. That's actually not true. Preparation, talking about what to expect is so important for kids, right? So whether it's a book from the library or a song, there's lots of songs, being sad and losing someone or something. Whether it's a conversation, out at Tim's and just hanging out, the two of us, and we're just chatting, or whether it's kicking around a soccer ball, making sure we take the time to get on the kid level, and translate. Hear them too, and where they're at, right? Because they'll surprise us. Kids are so smart. Wow, so smart. Good. Okay, for teenagers. Now, I don't have teenagers yet, but I've worked with a lot of teenagers, so I don't know if that makes me a credible source. But for those of you who have teenagers in your life, it is so normal for teenagers to have push and pull, right? To want help and then to pull away, and then to come towards and be really checked in, talking about their feelings, and then totally, gone. Allow for that. Developmentally, their brains are trying to grow, and what we need in adolescence is to figure out our own person, right? We need a little bit more space to do that. So it's okay to have a little bit of that with a teenager, right? Again, there's good checkpoints, right? Making sure they're safe, making sure they're looked after, but allow for that push and pull. It's kind of what we would advise. Okay, for adults, there's a lot to say, but some key things, some special considerations. Unexpected loss can be very difficult to process, right? Because you're dealing with many things, one of them being shock, okay? Unexpected loss is quite difficult to process. And so if you find yourself dealing with an unexpected loss, it might be time to reach out to talk to someone for professional help, because it can be really, really tough to make sense of it. We all know this, but death of our children are especially difficult. Okay, so that's a time to maybe consider reaching out for some professional help as well. And any kind of connection to someone who died by suicide is a bit complicated as well. So for adults who are grieving, that can be a time to reach out for help. And for older adults, older adulthood is a period of time developmentally marked by loss, right? It's marked by loss. And so there's something we call bereavement overload that can happen in older adults because there's just so much loss all over the place. And so there can be really tough things to process there. It might be a time to go get some help professionally. Now, grief is normal and it lasts your lifetime. But in prolonged grief, there's this stuckness. And it can be tough. It can be tough to point out, right? It can be tough to tell. Is this one of those moments, or is this just grief taking its natural course? But what to look for prolonged or complicated grief would be, going on past. That timing is so arbitrary because grief, but. Things just to look for would be, if someone's remaining stuck for years, really stuck, like really hard to do everyday activities. I can't diagnose, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I would just say, I wonder if they could use a professional supporter. I just wonder about that. So something to look out for. There's also something that I didn't put here called anticipatory grief. So when we know someone is going to pass, right? We know someone's going to die. If we know someone has an illness where they lose a lot of parts of their identity before they die, for example, well, then grief, starts pretty early, before they've even died, because we're losing the person. We're losing the person right in front of our eyes. It's very tricky. Now, for families and couples who are grieving, I work with couples a lot of the time, and it's very common. It's very common to, in acute grief, like right in the moments, months, years after the loss or the death, it can be really tough to maintain empathy of our partner, our spouse, for their way of grieving, right? It can be hard to kind of keep that empathy alive because our grief just zones us in, and we're trying to just take care of ourselves, just survive. So, it can be helpful for families or couples to come in and see a therapist a few times, to organize some things, kind of, maintain some of the balance, if things have kind of gotten out of whack or the routines are hard to keep up, so just something to consider. And for communities who are grieving, there is, I don't know if WB, Wayne, you'll have to tell me, do you still do a Blue Christmas service?
Yeah.
Okay,
I have information, I'll explain it. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so more coming on that. But, there's something really special about gathering as a community. In different faith traditions or cultural traditions, we all have these rituals of gathering to grieve. Lean into those. They're there for a reason. They're age-old. They've been there since the beginning of time, right? So really leaning into some of those rituals, some of those spaces to connect to a wider network. On that note, though, there's something called disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief happens when someone's grieving something that is socially unacceptable. So I just invite you, in the communities that you are in, to be looking out for someone who might not feel they have the space or may not be allowed to be grieving. And just look out for those people because it's a real thing. We all have people on the edges of our community. Is it safe to come in here and be with you in my grief? And so just having eyes to look out for that and making sure that we make it socially acceptable to just be human and grieve. Well, I again just wanted to reiterate that the hardest grief is your own grief. So we're not comparing griefs by going through different kinds, they're all hard. And this time of year, at holidays, can be especially tricky. And so I think it's apt timing to have a workshop like this. It's a great question. I was listening to some top lectures on grief in preparation, and one of the lecturers said, we just survive. I mean, let's just be honest. I can tell you all the best practices, but really we're just trying to survive. And so it is tricky because with not fully developed brain, right? It's very challenging to throw that kind of survival need onto a teenager, right? They have agency, but they don't have agency, and they're making sense of all the... Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think there's one way. But I do think that teenagers, they pay attention to consistency, and they pay attention to invitations, and sometimes, with teenagers, we have to sow seeds for later on, as painful as it is, because we kind of want to rescue them, let's just have just be with me, come on, just talk to me, but they, so sometimes, even just getting them in for one session with a therapist, even if it's pulling teeth, and explaining to the therapist like they don't want to be here. A good therapist will recognize, okay, we're not going to solve grief, we're not going to work through grief today, but we're going to create a situation where the teenager will know what to expect when they're ready to come back. See that? Yeah. And as a parent, it's because you're grieving too, right? So it's very challenging. I'm biased because I'm a therapist, but my best advice would be to go get your own therapy, to be able to cope with it so that it doesn't bleed into the way you interact with your child, right? So it will, but if we can kind of contain our own process a little bit and really be working on it in depth somewhere else, then when we're with our teenager, we can not put it away, but kind of move it just over here so I can be with you in your grief and what you need. I think of it as, like when I say sowing seeds, I think of it almost as a roundabout where you can get on at many different points to get on the new road, right? So just offering lots of, and there might be one day where they take you up on it, I'm a big fan of the arts with teenagers. Works almost every time, in my opinion, as an invitation to process hard things. Hey, why don't you share some songs you've been listening to lately? Hey, do you want to take an art class with me? Hey, do you want to... there's something about the arts where there's no words, but you actually process a lot. And I won't bore you with the brain science behind that, but it's true. So I wonder, in your case, different invitations that are non-threatening, but will still allow, right? Because it's those three things, right? Act, ask, allow. It's kind of what we gotta hone in on. So really trying to be with them in it, but not letting them just, pull away as best you can, right? Trying to give them invitations. And modeling, right? Modeling what it's like to stick to a routine and really try your best. Sure, yeah. I mean, there's books you can read on grief. There's lots of books. I don't know if you'll find them all helpful, but you can certainly find them. And so there's lots of... I always like, more and more So funny, How science, we research things that we've done for, anyways, doesn't matter. But the point is, we're now researching rituals, the impact of rituals, which if you've ever belonged to a community, I mean, yes, we do rituals, this is obvious, right? Like we say good morning in the morning, or we turn on the light, or we say a prayer if it's a faith community, or we sing songs, so there's rituals everywhere. But now we're starting to research the impact of rituals, how important they are. So as an adult, especially on your own, living on your own, and if you're not surrounded by a family or a community, it can be helpful to have rituals be grounding some of the experience of grief. Because some of the communal rituals are kind of forced on you, like being woken up first thing in the morning by a child, for example, and being forced to have breakfast at 6 in the morning. Whereas if you're alone and you're living alone, it can be harder to kind of have those checkpoints and accountabilities, right? So kind of maybe taking time to sit down and write out, how will I remember? And how will I stay well? What are rituals for remembering and what are rituals for staying well?